Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be tackling AI and equity in K-12 education. It's such a hot topic right now, and I think there's a lot to unpack.
Absolutely, and it seems like everyone's got an opinion on it. Luckily, we've got a good mix of sources to help us dive in.
We do. We've got the Forbes article, AI for Equity, which is pretty optimistic, an APA article looking at AI ethics and equity, which is always an important angle.
Right. And we've also got that Inside Higher Ed piece on AI in higher education, which might give us some insights into how this all could trickle down to K-12.
Yeah, definitely. Plus, we've got that, what is it, a YouTube video from global Silicon Valley?
That's the one. That one really digs into the bias in AI, which I think is going to be really relevant to our conversation.
For sure. So should we just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay, so one thing that really stood out to me, like right off the bat, was just how AI can be this like double-edged sword when it comes to equity.
Yeah, it's not a clear-cut good or bad thing.
Right.
Like, you read that Forbes piece and you come away feeling pretty hopeful. Sahota, he's the author, he's arguing that AI is already helping to improve racial equality.
Yeah, he's got those examples right. Like AI-driven recruitment at Unilever, I think they saw a 16% increase in minority hires.
16%. It's a pretty big jump.
Huge. And then there's that Zebra medical vision thing, using AI to try and address disparities in healthcare, and diagnosis and treatment.
Yeah, you see stuff like that and you think, okay, AI can actually be a force for good here.
Totally. But then you switch gears, you read those Inside Higher Ed and APA articles, and it's like, uh-oh, there's some serious concerns.
Yeah, there's that warning that AI could make existing inequalities even worse, especially, for students who don't have as much access to technology or who haven't had as much exposure to AI tools.
Right. It's almost like any powerful tool, like it can be used for good or bad, depending on who's using it and how.
Exactly.
And then they bring up that whole risk of algorithmic bias, and we've seen that play out in other areas already.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, remember that Amazon recruiting tool? The one that ended up discriminating against women?
Oh, yeah. Classic example of how AI can just perpetuate biases if we're not super careful.
Totally. And that kind of ties into the global Silicon Valley video, too, where the speaker's talking about those power dynamics. He gets pretty fired up about it.
He does. He's got a point, though.
He does. He does. He talks about how even something as simple as, like, image generators, when you put in prompts like doctor and nurse,
Yeah.
they often reinforce those stereotypes, like gender and racial stereotypes.
Yeah.
Even if you don't specifically say, like, white male doctor or anything.
It's like those biases are baked in, even without us realizing it.
Yeah, which is super scary when you start thinking about using AI to predict, like, student outcomes in K-12.
Right. Imagine, like, AI being used to identify gifted students or predict disciplinary issues, but it's basing those predictions on data that's already biased.
It could have huge consequences for kids.
Absolutely. And the APA article, it brings up some research from Mindy Schoss. She found that in societies where there's already a lot of inequality, people are even more worried about AI's potential to take away jobs.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If people are already struggling, that fear just gets amplified.
Yeah, totally. And if those anxieties exist out in the world, they're definitely going to show up in education, too.
For sure. So, okay, we've got this potential for bias, which is already a huge issue. But then there's also this whole other problem of access.
Ugh, the digital divide. It's like a broken record, but it's a real issue.
And that Inside Higher Ed piece really gets into it.
It does. They talk about a 2023 report, I think it was, that found huge differences in broadband access for students. And it breaks down along those same lines we always talk about demographics and location.
Right. So some kids don't even have reliable internet.
And on top of that, there's the cost of those fancy AI tools, right? Like the premium versions that can really make a difference.
Yeah, it's got to put low-income students at a disadvantage. It's almost like instead of using AI to close the gap, we might accidentally be making it wider.
That's the big fear. And it kind of brings us back to what that global Silicon Valley guy was saying, about power dynamics.
Yeah.
Who gets to decide which students get access to this technology? Who controls how these systems are developed? Like, are those decisions being made with equity in mind?
It's kind of a lot to think about, isn't it?
It is.
So, okay, we've got access issues, potential bias baked into the algorithms. Is there anything else we should be worried about?
Well, the APA article throws another wrench in the works, the whole risk of humans actually inheriting AI's biases.
Wait, what? Explain that one.
So they cite this research that shows even when the AI makes a mistake, people, like humans, tend to make the same biased decisions afterward. It's like we start to think like the AI even when it's wrong.
So it's not just about the AI itself, it's about how it can influence us. Wow. That's kind of terrifying when you think about it, especially if we have teachers using AI to grade student work or to assess them in any way.
Right. Like imagine a teacher relying on an AI tool that consistently gives lower scores to students from certain backgrounds, even if those students are just as capable. It could have a huge impact on those kids' learning and their opportunities.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. Like you start with biased data, the AI learns those biases, and then those biases actually influence human judgment.
And it keeps getting worse.
Right.
Okay, so we've got access issues, biased algorithms, the potential for us to become biased ourselves.
And we can't forget the potential for, companies to actually exploit human biases through AI.
Oh, right. The APA article mentioned that too.
Yeah. They use those AI dating recommendations as an example. Like,
Right.
these algorithms might not be designed to help us find the best match, but rather to keep us hooked on the app, even if it means playing on our insecurities.
Okay, yeah. Now that you mention it, that makes sense.
Right. It's just a reminder that a lot of these systems aren't designed with our best interests in mind.
Yeah, there's a lot of profit motive behind this stuff.
Definitely.
So to recap, we've got access issues, biased algorithms, the potential for us to absorb those biases, and then the fact that some companies might actually be using AI to manipulate us.
That about sums it up.
That's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And
Yeah.
we're just scratching the surface here.
I know, right?
And that global Silicon Valley guy, he also brought up this really important point about dehumanization, especially in education, if we start relying too much on AI.
Oh, yeah, he was talking about how important human connection is, right?
Right.
Especially for K-12 kids.
Exactly. Like, how do we make sure students are still getting that support and guidance they need from real people, from teachers and mentors?
Yeah, we can't just replace teachers with robots.
Right.
That's a good point. So that kind of leads into, one of the big questions. How do we make sure everyone, teachers, students, everyone has the skills to, think critically about this stuff?
Exactly. Like, how do we teach people to question AI outputs, to challenge potential biases? It's not enough to just hand them these tools. We need to give them the knowledge and the skills to use them responsibly.
Yeah, we need people to be informed and empowered,
Yeah.
not just, blindly following whatever the AI says.
Exactly. And that comes back to, those power dynamics again. Like, who gets to define what responsible use of AI even looks like in education?
That's a big question.
Mhm.
And are we making sure that everyone's voice is being heard?
Right. Because if we're not careful, this technology could just end up reinforcing the same old inequalities.
It's a lot to think about. But I also feel like these challenges aren't insurmountable, right? Like the sources we're looking at, they offer some solutions too.
Absolutely. It's not all doom and gloom.
It's going to take effort, though.
Yeah.
Like everyone needs to be involved, educators, policymakers, the people developing these technologies. We all need to work together to make sure AI is being used fairly and responsibly in K-12.
I completely agree. And one of the things that keeps coming up is this need for more transparency in how these AI systems are developed and used.
Right. Like that global Silicon Valley speaker. He was basically begging us to demand more information.
He wants to know what data sets are being used to train these algorithms, what biases might be hiding in there, how those decisions are being made.
He's all about shedding light on those black boxes.
Exactly. And it's not just about demanding that information, it's about using it to hold developers accountable.
Yeah, like making sure they're actually addressing these bias and equity issues in their design process.
Exactly.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Exactly. We need to shine a light on these algorithms, make sure they're serving all students fairly.
Okay, so we've talked about the bias risks, the access challenges, that whole thing about us inheriting AI's biases, and the need for more transparency. But what about, concrete actions? What can we actually do to address these issues?
Well, one thing that comes up again and again is the need for more diversity in the field of AI development itself.
That makes sense, right?
It does. That global Silicon Valley video really drives this point home. The speaker talks about how so often he sees these AI development teams that are, very homogenous, very limited in their perspectives.
Not a lot of different voices in the room.
Exactly. And that lack of diversity, it almost inevitably leads to algorithms that reflect those limited viewpoints.
So we need more women, more people of color, more people from different backgrounds involved in building these systems.
Absolutely. We need to create a pipeline of diverse talent, people who can bring their unique perspectives to the table and make sure these algorithms are serving everyone.
Yeah, diversity of thought is key.
It is. And that's where policy and regulation can play a big role. Like,
Right.
we need policies that incentivize diversity in the tech industry, that fund research into AI bias, that hold developers accountable for creating systems that are fair and equitable for everyone.
Right, because right now it's kind of like the Wild West out there.
It is.
And we're seeing some interesting legal stuff happening too, right?
Yeah.
Didn't that Inside Higher Ed article mention that New York State passed a law requiring companies to tell employees if AI is being used in hiring or promotion decisions?
Oh, yeah. That's a great example of how legislation can actually be used to promote transparency and accountability.
Right. It's a step in the right direction.
It is. It's basically saying, hey, these algorithms shouldn't be operating in a black box.
I like that. It's interesting how all these pieces are starting to connect. It's not just about the technology itself, it's about the whole social, political, and economic context that it's being developed in.
Right. It's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. But I think by recognizing those complexities, by having these open and honest conversations, and by working together to come up with solutions, we can actually use AI for good. We can make sure it's helping to create a more equitable and just world.
Yeah, I think that's important to remember. It's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of potential here. And that global Silicon Valley speaker, he said something that really stuck with me. He talked about how the most important thing we can do is ask the right questions.
Oh, yeah. He's big on that.
He is. And I think that's a great place to transition to the next part of our conversation.
I agree. Because ultimately, the future of AI in education depends on the choices we make today. Like the questions we ask, the policies we advocate for, the values we prioritize, all of that will shape how this technology is used and who benefits from it.
So what are some of those key questions for you? Like what stands out as particularly crucial right now as we're kind of navigating this AI frontier?
For me, it boils down to a few fundamental things. Like first, are we using AI to reinforce existing power structures, or are we using it to challenge those structures and create more opportunities for everyone? Second, are we making sure that all students have equitable access to AI education and the resources they need to thrive in a world where technology is so important? And finally, are we teaching students to be critical thinkers, to question AI outputs, to advocate for themselves and their communities?
Those are some big questions.
They are.
And it makes me wonder, how do we move beyond just talking about these things? How do we take this from the theoretical and turn it into action? Like, what can educators, parents, policymakers, what can they do right now to make sure that AI in K-12 is serving all students fairly?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thankfully, the sources we're looking at, they do offer some concrete starting points.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I guess we should dig into those in the next part of our deep dive.
Let's do it.
I think one of the most practical things we can do is push for policies that really prioritize equity and ethics in AI development.
Yeah, that global Silicon Valley guy was pretty passionate about that.
For good reason. He was all about demanding transparency from these developers. Like, what data are they using to train these algorithms? What kind of biases could be lurking in there?
He wants to know what's in the secret sauce, right?
Exactly. It can't just be a mystery black box, especially when we're talking about using AI in education. The stakes are way too high for kids.
The APA Monitor article kind of touched on that too, didn't they? Something about clear policies on data privacy and algorithmic transparency.
They did, especially since we're talking about K-12, with minors involved. We need to know exactly what data they're collecting on these students, how it's being used, and what protections are in place.
It's not just about protecting data, though, right? It's also about making sure those algorithms are actually fair and unbiased.
Oh, absolutely. We can't just take the developer's word for it. We need to push for algorithms that are, like, auditable, explainable.
So we can see how the sausage is made.
Exactly. We need to be able to see the inner workings, make sure there's no bias baked in from the start.
Speaking of baking things in, that Forbes article also talked about representation in AI development teams, like having more diverse teams.
That's a huge one. If the people designing these systems don't reflect the diversity of the students they're supposed to be helping, we're going to end up with algorithms that just perpetuate existing inequalities.
So we need more women, more people of color, more people from different backgrounds involved in building this stuff.
100%. We need to create a pipeline of diverse talent, people who can bring different perspectives to the table and make sure these algorithms are serving everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do we do that?
Well, policy and regulation are a big part of it. We need policies that encourage diversity in the tech industry,
Hmm.
policies that fund research into AI bias, and hold developers accountable for creating systems that are fair for everyone.
Right, because right now it feels like there aren't a lot of rules.
It's the Wild West out there.
Speaking of rules, didn't that Inside Higher Ed article talk about a law in New York? Something about companies having to tell employees if they're using AI in hiring and promotions.
Yes. That's a great example of how we can use legislation to promote transparency and accountability with AI.
It's like no more hiding behind the curtain.
Exactly. Those algorithms shouldn't be operating in a black box.
It's really interesting how all of this stuff connects. It's not just about the technology itself, it's about the whole context. It exists in social, political, economic.
It's a big, tangled web, and there's no easy answer. But I think just acknowledging that complexity, having these open and honest conversations, and working together to find solutions is how we make AI a force for good.
Right. Not a force for evil.
Exactly. We want it to help create a more equitable world, not make things worse.
That global Silicon Valley guy really emphasized that, didn't he? Like, he was saying the most important thing we can do is ask the right questions.
He was all about asking the tough questions.
And I think that leads perfectly into the next part of our conversation. Because at the end of the day, the future of AI in education really hinges on the choices we're making right now. The questions we ask, the policies we support, the values we prioritize, all of that is going to determine how this technology is used and who ultimately benefits from it.
A lot of responsibility.
It is. So let's talk about solutions. What are some things we can actually do?
Well, the APA Monitor article talked about advocating for policies that prioritize equity and ethics in AI development, like demanding more transparency from developers, knowing what datasets are being used to train these algorithms, and what potential biases might be hidden in there.
Okay, so being informed is important. What else?
And it can't stop at just being informed. We need to hold developers accountable for addressing those bias and equity issues in the design process.
It's like actively pushing for change.
Exactly. The Forbes article also emphasized the need for more diverse representation on AI development teams. Just makes sense. If the people building these systems come from diverse backgrounds, they'll be more likely to create algorithms that serve everyone.
So encouraging more women and people of color to go into STEM fields is a good place to start.
Absolutely. We need policies that support and promote diversity and inclusion across the entire tech industry. And beyond that, the ATA Monitor article highlights the importance of human oversight when using these AI tools. It's not enough to just rely on the algorithms. We need trained professionals who can interpret the outputs, spot potential bias, and ultimately make decisions that are in the best interests of all students.
So teachers need to be trained on how to use these tools effectively and responsibly.
Exactly. They need to understand how these algorithms work, how to recognize bias, and how to advocate for their students if something seems off. We need to be building AI literacy and ethical considerations into teacher training programs.
That's a pretty big shift in how we think about educating teachers, isn't it?
It is, but it's absolutely essential if we want to use AI responsibly in K-12 education. And it's not just about the teachers. Students need this training too.
Oh, interesting. So like digital citizenship, but for AI.
Exactly. Students need to develop the skills to question what they see from AI, to understand its limitations, and to advocate for themselves if they need to. We need to empower them to be informed and critical users of this technology.
So everyone needs to be aware of the potential pitfalls of AI and be prepared to question it.
Precisely. We're at a crossroads with this technology. It has incredible potential, but it also comes with serious risks. The choices we make now will determine whether AI in education helps close the equity gap or makes it even wider.
It feels like a lot is riding on this.
It is. We have a responsibility to get this right for the sake of all students.
Yeah, we can't mess this up. That sense of responsibility really came through in all of those articles. It's not just about the technology, it's about the values that drive its development and use.
Right. The human element is crucial. And speaking of the human element, the APA Monitor article also mentioned something pretty unsettling: companies intentionally exploiting human biases through AI.
Oh yeah, they brought up the example of those AI dating apps, right? Like maybe they're not designed to help you find a good match, but to keep you using the app, even if it preys on your insecurities.
Exactly. It's a little scary to think about, isn't it?
It is. Like, it makes you question the motivations behind all of this AI development.
Uh-huh.
Are these systems really being created to help people? Or are we just chasing profits, even if it means exploiting our vulnerabilities?
It's a tough question, and it forces us to really confront the ethics of all of this. Who benefits? Who gets hurt? are we thinking about those things carefully enough?
It feels like such a big, complex problem. Where do we even start?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that the problem exists. We need to educate ourselves about the potential risks of AI, both in terms of bias and its impact on society as a whole.
So awareness is key. What comes after that?
Well, we can support organizations and initiatives that are pushing for ethical AI development. There are a lot of groups out there advocating for transparency, accountability, and diversity in the tech industry.
That's a good idea. But what about on a personal level? What can regular people do to make a difference?
Staying informed and engaged is huge. Read articles, watch videos, attend events. Keep learning about AI and its impact on your life.
So basically, have more conversations like this one.
Exactly. The more we talk about these issues, the more likely we are to find solutions.
Right. And that global Silicon Valley speaker, he was a big advocate for pushing for policies that promote equity and ethics in AI.
He was. It's about making sure our elected officials understand how important this is and holding them accountable for taking action.
So contacting our representatives, writing letters to the editor, getting involved in local advocacy groups, all of that can help.
Absolutely. I can't just sit back and hope someone else fixes this. We all have a responsibility to shape the future of AI.
And speaking of the future, that same speaker also talked about how we need to be preparing students for a world where AI is everywhere.
He did. And that's not just about teaching them coding or technical skills. It's about helping them develop critical thinking, problem solving, and communication skills. The kinds of skills they'll need to navigate a world where AI is constantly changing things.
So it's not just about teaching them how to use the technology, but also how to think about its impact on society.
Exactly. We need to help them become informed and engaged citizens who can shape the future of AI in a positive way.
It's almost like we're not just mitigating the risks of AI, but also trying to unlock its potential for good.
That's a great way to put it. AI can be a powerful force for progress and equity, but only if we make it so.
Wow. I feel like we've really gone deep on this. We talked about bias and AI, the difficulties with access, the whole transparency and accountability thing, and why human oversight is so important.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. And it's obvious that these aren't simple, isolated issues, right? They're all tangled up together.
Totally. There's no easy fix, but I do think these conversations are crucial.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest takeaways for me is that we can't just leave this up to tech companies and politicians.
Right. It can't just be them figuring it out.
We all have a responsibility to make sure AI is being used ethically and thoughtfully, especially when it comes to education.
Yeah, that global Silicon Valley guy was really adamant about that. He talked about the need for collective action. Like everyone, educators, parents, community members, we need to be the ones demanding that AI in K-12 is being used fairly and responsibly.
He made a good point. And it's not just him. The APA Monitor article also stressed the importance of speaking up, both individually and at a bigger level.
So what does that actually look like?
Yeah.
What can we do to make a real difference?
Well, educating ourselves and others about these issues is a great place to start. The more people understand the potential impact of AI in education, the good and the bad, the better equipped we'll be to make smart decisions about its use.
So share articles, talk to friends and family, basically just spread the word.
Exactly. We need to raise awareness and make sure everyone understands what's at stake here.
Okay, but what about actually doing something? Like influencing how AI is used in schools?
Engaging with our local school boards and politicians is crucial. Let them know that we care about these issues and that we expect them to prioritize equity and ethics in any decisions about AI in education.
So attend school board meetings, write to our representatives, things like that.
Exactly. We need to make our voices heard and make it clear that we're paying attention.
The Inside Higher Ed article also mentioned supporting organizations that are fighting for ethical AI.
Yes. There are lots of groups out there pushing for transparency, accountability, and diversity in tech.
And we can support them through donations, volunteering, or even just getting the word out about what they do.
Exactly. Amplifying their message and helping them gain traction.
The Forbes article talked about how consumers actually have a lot of power.
Yeah.
We can choose to support companies that are committed to developing and using AI ethically, and we can avoid the ones that aren't.
Right. We vote with our wallets every single day. By making conscious choices about the products and services we use, we can send a strong message to companies about what we value.
It's not just about what we buy, though, is it? It's also about how we use AI ourselves.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of the potential biases baked into these systems and use them with a critical eye.
So double-check those results. Don't blindly trust everything the algorithm tells us.
Exactly. Use your own judgment and common sense. It all comes back to that human oversight we were talking about earlier.
So it sounds like we've got a lot of work to do, both individually and as a society.
We do. But I honestly believe we can get this right.
I agree. And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is that we need to be actively involved. We can't just sit back and assume that AI will magically solve all our problems.
Absolutely not. We need to be engaged, informed, and vocal if we want AI to be a force for good, especially in education.
We need to make sure it's used to create a more equitable and just world for all students.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about using this technology to build a brighter future for everyone.
Well said. Well, I think that about wraps it up for our deep dive today.
It does.
Thanks to everyone for listening. We hope this has given you some things to think about, maybe even inspired you to take some action.
Remember, the future of AI is still being written. It's up to all of us to make sure it's a good one.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a better world.